Jax's revenge domain. My new corporate safety director marched onto the hangar floor and fired me on the spot, calling me a paranoid old-timer who was holding up progress. What he didn't realize was I held the only Level 3 ultrasonic testing certification that could clear our entire fleet for flight. So I packed my toolbox, walked out into the storm, and made one phone call that grounded 400 flights and destroyed his entire career. My name is Garrett Henderson, and I'm 56 years old. For 33 years, I've worked aircraft maintenance at this regional hub, starting as a green kid fresh out of the Navy. I still remember my first day here in 1991, terrified I'd mess up something that could kill people. That fear never really left me. And maybe that's what made me good at this job. Back in the Navy, I served 6 years as an aviation machinist mate on the USS Independence. We lost a good man named Tommy Rodriguez to a maintenance failure, faulty torque specs on a landing gear assembly that nobody caught during inspection. Tommy's FA-18 went down during a training exercise off San Diego. He was 23, engaged to his high school sweetheart, planning to get out and become a commercial pilot. Instead, he became a reminder that in aviation maintenance, there's no such thing as close enough. After Tommy's accident, I became obsessed with precision. Every bolt torqued to exact specifications, every inspection completed to the letter, every piece of paperwork documented perfectly. My shipmates called me paranoid, but the chief petty officer who'd worked flight deck operations for 20 years told me something I never forgot. Henderson, paranoid mechanics live longer and save more lives than confident ones. When I got out of the Navy in 1988, I spent 3 years getting my airframe and power plant license, then my specialized certifications in non-destructive testing. It took me another 5 years to earn my Level 3 ultrasonic testing qualification. That certification meant I could make final airworthiness determinations on commercial aircraft, essentially deciding whether a plane full of people lived or died. My wife Sarah used to joke that I loved airplanes more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong. Sarah and I divorced 12 years ago, but we remained friends. She understood that my work wasn't just a job, it was a mission. Every time I signed off on an aircraft inspection, I thought about Tommy Rodriguez. Every time I cleared a plane for takeoff, I imagined my own grandkids Jake and Emma sitting in those seats. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when the emergency maintenance call came through. A Delta 737 had reported unusual vibrations during taxi at Denver, and they'd diverted here for inspection. The storm outside was hammering the hangar with sheets of rain that sounded like machine gun fire on the metal roof. Weather was the least of my concerns when I powered up my ultrasonic testing equipment. The Sonatus SiteScan 250 ultrasonic flaw detector is a $35,000 piece of precision equipment that can detect cracks in metal down to microscopic levels. I'd calibrated this particular unit myself, using standardized test blocks to ensure accuracy within 0.1 millimeters. When I ran the probe along the engine mount assembly, watching the A-scan display trace across my screen, the readings made my blood run cold. Stress fractures. Not just hairline surface cracks, but deep propagation through the aluminum bracket assembly. The ultrasonic waves were bouncing back in patterns that told a story of metal fatigue, repeated thermal cycling, and maintenance intervals that had been stretched beyond safe limits. The mounting brackets were crying for help in frequencies only my equipment could hear. I'd been doing this long enough to recognize the signature of impending catastrophic failure. The stress concentration was approaching critical thresholds. If that engine decided to separate during takeoff roll, when the aircraft was loaded with fuel and climbing through 500 feet, we wouldn't have survivors. We'd have a smoking crater and 150 body bags. The problem was Preston Clark, our newly appointed corporate safety director. Clark had blown in from headquarters 4 months ago with an MBA from Wharton, a collection of expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and absolutely zero understanding of what happens when corporate efficiency meets aviation reality. He was a 42-year-old spreadsheet warrior who saw maintenance delays as profit killers and safety protocols as antiquated suggestions that interfered with operational metrics. Clark had already pushed through what he called optimization initiatives that cut average inspection times by 30%. He'd replaced 3 experienced mechanics with contract workers who couldn't tell a torque wrench from a tire iron, but worked for half the pay. He'd eliminated what he termed redundant safety checks and pressured supervisors to expedite turnaround times to improve the company's on-time performance statistics. Most disturbing, Clark had instituted a new policy requiring cost-benefit analysis for any maintenance action that would delay an aircraft more than 2 hours. As if you could calculate the dollar value of human lives against the inconvenience of schedule disruptions. I'd tried to explain to him that aviation maintenance wasn't like managing a retail store. Federal regulations existed for reasons written in blood, learned from crashes that killed hundreds of people. But Clark viewed my concerns as resistance to change, the stubborn complaints of an aging workforce that couldn't adapt to modern business practices. Now he was about to learn that some things couldn't be optimized, streamlined, or made more efficient. Sometimes the old way was the only right way, especially when 150 passengers were counting on every decision I made. At 4:15 a.m., I keyed my radio to maintenance control, my hands steady despite the gravity of what I was about to report. This is Henderson on Delta 8847. I'm showing critical stress indicators on the number 2 engine mount. We need to red tag this bird immediately. The response came back in Clark's sharp, irritated voice. He'd apparently decided to monitor the overnight shift from his climate-controlled office upstairs, probably reviewing quarterly reports while I dealt with life-and-death decisions on the hangar floor. Henderson, this is Clark. What's your estimated repair time? I looked at the ultrasonic display showing crack propagation through critical structural elements. The stress fractures weren't just surface imperfections. They were deep fissures that had been growing for months, probably accelerated by the maintenance shortcuts Clark had implemented. Sir, this isn't a repair situation. These stress fractures require complete bracket replacement. We're looking at minimum 48 hours, probably 72 with parts procurement. The radio went silent for a long moment. I could almost hear the calculator in Clark's head, adding up the cost of grounded aircraft, passenger compensation, and schedule disruptions. When he came back, his tone had shifted to something cold and calculated. Henderson, I'm looking at the operational impact here. That aircraft needs to be back in service for the morning departure bank. Can you sign off a temporary flight clearance? A temporary flight clearance. In aviation maintenance, that phrase was like asking a doctor to sign off on surgery while blindfolded. I stared at the ultrasonic display, watching the echo patterns that revealed metal crying out in frequencies beyond human hearing. Negative, sir. This aircraft is not airworthy. I cannot and will not certify it for flight. Henderson, you're looking at hairline surface imperfections. I've consulted with our engineering department, and they assure me these readings are within acceptable tolerance ranges. The engineering department. That would be Clark's MBA buddy from headquarters. Some 30-year-old consultant who'd never held a wrench in his life, but could generate PowerPoint presentations explaining why safety regulations were outdated obstacles to profitability. I'd seen this playbook before, minus corporate types making technical decisions based on financial models, while the people who actually understood aircraft were told to shut up and comply. Mr. Clark, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. With respect, I've been reading ultrasonic data since before your engineering consultant learned to tie his shoes. This metal is compromised. The stress concentration indicates imminent failure. I'm grounding this aircraft. What happened next was vintage Clark. He came storming down from his office in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, looking like he was headed to a country club instead of an aircraft hangar. His Italian leather loafers clicked against the concrete floor as he approached my workstation, his face flushed with the righteous indignation of a man who'd never been told no by someone he considered beneath him. Henderson, he barked, his voice echoing off the hangar walls. I've had it with your obstructionist attitude. You've been dragging your feet on every inspection for months, hiding behind outdated protocols and excessive caution. I gestured toward the ultrasonic equipment, its screen displaying the technical evidence that could save 150 lives. I follow federal aviation regulations, sir. Nothing more, nothing less. The FAA guidelines are minimums, Henderson. Our job is to optimize operations while maintaining safety margins. You're treating every minor indication like a catastrophic failure. Minor indication. I thought about Tommy Rodriguez, whose minor landing gear issue had turned into a smoking crater in the Pacific Ocean. I thought about my grandkids Jake and Emma, who might someday board an aircraft that some corporate executive had deemed acceptable risk for the sake of quarterly profits. Mr. Clark, I said, pointing to the ultrasonic display, these aren't minor indications. Look at the propagation pattern. The stress concentration is approaching critical thresholds. This bracket assembly is 72 hours away from catastrophic failure. Clark didn't even glance at the screen. He probably couldn't read ultrasonic data if his bonus depended on it. That's technician-level detail work, Henderson. I deal with big-picture operational efficiency. And the big picture says this aircraft flies in 3 hours with a full passenger load. Something clicked in my head at that moment. This wasn't about safety versus efficiency. This was about a man who'd built his career on PowerPoint presentations, telling a 33-year aviation professional that his expertise didn't matter. This was about corporate arrogance dismissing decades of hard-earned knowledge because it interfered with profit margins. I dealt with officers like this in the Navy, guys who'd never turned a wrench or diagnosed a mechanical failure, but felt qualified to override the judgment of experienced technicians. The difference was, in the Navy, stupid decisions got you court-martialed. In corporate aviation, they got you promoted, Mr. Clark, I said, my voice dropping to the tone I'd learned from that old chief petty officer. I'm the only level 3 NDT technician on this field. My certification allows me to make final airworthiness determinations on this aircraft type. Without my signature on the inspection documents, this plane doesn't move. Clark's face flushed red, the veins in his forehead standing out like a road map. You think you're indispensable because you've got some technical certification? You're a 56-year-old mechanic, Henderson. I can have you replaced by lunch with someone who understands operational priorities. Then you'll need to find someone else with 8,000 hours of ultrasonic testing experience, federal authorization to certify structural integrity on commercial aircraft, and the willingness to sign their name to a death warrant. That last phrase hung in the air between us like a challenge. Clark's eyes narrowed as he realized I wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to compromise, wasn't going to let him bully me into signing off on an unsafe aircraft just to protect his performance metrics. Fine, he said, his voice shaking with rage. You want to play hardball? You're done, Henderson, effective immediately. Turn in your tools, your access cards, and your attitude. Security will escort you off the premises. I should have felt something: anger, betrayal, maybe fear about my pension and health insurance. Instead, I felt the same calm I'd learned in the Navy when everything was going sideways and you had to trust your training and your instincts. I'd been in this situation before, 15 years ago, when another corporate hotshot had tried to pressure me into cutting corners on a helicopter inspection. That time, I'd stood my ground and saved 12 lives when the rotor assembly failed during a test flight. The corporate executive who'd tried to override my judgment was quietly transferred to another division. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting the consequences. Even when they seemed unfair, I knew exactly what came next in Clark's little power play. He was about to discover that aviation maintenance wasn't like managing a restaurant chain where you could replace an experienced cook with anyone who could follow a recipe. Federal law required specific certifications for specific tasks, and those certifications took years of training and thousands of hours of hands-on experience to earn. I powered down my ultrasonic equipment, carefully securing the calibrated probes in their protective cases. Each probe was precision manufactured and calibrated to standards that cost $8,000 to replace. Without these tools and without my certification, Clark's operation was about to become very expensive paperweights. More importantly, I slipped the access cards for the testing bay and equipment storage into my coat pocket. Those cards weren't just pieces of plastic. They were the keys to $200,000 worth of specialized testing equipment that only I was qualified to operate. Clark could fire me, but he couldn't instantly create another level 3 NDT technician. You're making a mistake, Mr. Clark, I said, hoisting my toolbox. The weight of it reminded me of all the years I'd carried these tools, all the aircraft I'd cleared for safe flight, all the lives I'd protected with careful, methodical work. Get off my property before I call the police, he snapped, already turning away to bark orders at a bewildered junior mechanic who was watching this confrontation with wide eyes. The walk from the hangar to the parking lot gave me time to think about what Clark was about to face. By 6:30 a.m., he'd have 8 aircraft scheduled for departure, carrying over 1,200 passengers. Without qualified inspection personnel, every single plane would sit grounded at the gate. The company's insurance wouldn't cover operational costs for aircraft that hadn't received proper safety certification. Clark would try to bring in contract inspectors from other facilities. But that would take hours, and those contractors wouldn't have the specific qualifications needed for our fleet. He'd discovered that you can't just hire someone off the street to perform ultrasonic testing on commercial aircraft engines. The Federal Aviation Administration doesn't accept good enough when passenger safety is involved. More importantly, I had a phone call to make. Shane Bennett and I went back to our Navy days, working flight deck operations on the USS Independence. Shane had saved my life during a deck fire in the Persian Gulf when burning jet fuel turned our workspace into a furnace. I'd returned the favor 3 months later during a hydraulic failure that nearly took his head off with a high-pressure line. After our service, Shane had gone into accident investigation while I'd stayed with hands-on maintenance. He was now a senior investigator with the National Transportation Safety Board, the federal agency responsible for investigating aviation accidents and ensuring safety compliance. Shane was about to become very interested in our little operation here. I sat in my pickup truck in the employee lot, rain drumming on the roof like an irregular heartbeat. The storm was getting worse, which would make Clark's morning even more complicated. Weather delays combined with grounded aircraft would create a cascade of operational problems that his MBA training hadn't prepared him for. I scrolled through my phone contacts until I found the number I hadn't dialed in 2 years. Shane Bennett, NTSB, direct line. It was early, but aviation investigators don't keep regular hours. When planes fall out of the sky, they work around the clock to figure out why. Bennett, NTSB, came the familiar gravelly voice that still carried traces of a Boston accent. Shane, it's Dutch Henderson. Dutch. Hell, I haven't heard from you in 2 years. How's life treating you, old man? Could be better. I just got fired for refusing to sign off a compromised aircraft. My boss wants to fly passengers on an airframe with stress fractures in the engine mounts. The line went completely quiet. I could almost hear Shane's brain shifting into investigation mode. The casual warmth replaced by professional focus. When he spoke again, every trace of humor was gone. Tell me you're joking, Dutch. Dead serious. Delta 8847, tail number N477DA. Critical stress indicators in the number 2 engine mount bracket assembly. Ultrasonic testing shows crack propagation approaching failure thresholds. Corporate Safety Director ordered me to ignore the findings and certify for flight. Sweet Mother of God. I could hear typing in the background, probably accessing federal databases and safety records. You documented everything. Full ultrasonic mapping, metallurgical analysis, digital photos of the test results, and Shane, this isn't the first time. Clark's been pressuring mechanics to speed up inspections for months. I think you'll find a pattern of deferred maintenance and abbreviated safety protocols. Dutch, if what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at systematic safety violations. This goes way beyond a personnel dispute. I thought about the 3 experienced mechanics Clark had replaced with cheaper contract workers. I thought about the redundant safety checks he'd eliminated. I thought about the pressure he'd put on supervisors to expedite inspections regardless of what they found. There's more, Shane. Clark's been overriding maintenance schedules to improve efficiency metrics. He's created artificial cost savings by cutting corners on safety procedures. I have documentation going back 4 months showing systematic violations of FAA maintenance requirements. Stay exactly where you are, Shane commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of federal law enforcement. Don't go back on that property. Don't talk to anyone from the company. I'm initiating an emergency operational review and dispatching a team. This facility is about to be locked down tighter than Fort Knox. As I hung up the phone, I could see the first signs of chaos beginning inside the terminal building. Passengers were starting to gather around departure monitors, probably wondering why their flights weren't boarding on schedule. Gate agents were making increasingly frantic phone calls. And somewhere in the administrative offices, Preston Clark was about to discover that aviation safety wasn't negotiable. By 6:30 a.m., the consequences of Clark's decision began cascading through the operation like a mechanical failure in a complex engine. The morning departure bank was supposed to move 8 aircraft carrying 1,200 passengers to destinations across the country. Without qualified inspection personnel, every single plane sat grounded at the gate like expensive lawn ornaments. I watched from the diner across the street as confusion spread through the terminal. Passengers clustered around departure monitors showing delay after delay. Gate agents made increasingly frantic phone calls to supervisors who had no answers. And somewhere in the administrative offices, Preston Clark was discovering that aviation safety regulations weren't suggestions he could override with executive authority. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Green, our tower supervisor who'd been working at the facility almost as long as I had. Dutch, what did you do? Clark's running around like his hair's on fire. He's demanding someone override your testing holds. I typed back, can't override federal certification requirements. Need level 3 NDT approval for structural releases. He's trying to bring in contract inspectors from Denver, ETA 4 hours. That made me smile grimly. Clark was about to learn that ultrasonic testing certifications weren't interchangeable like driver's licenses. Each aircraft type required specific qualification training. The Denver contractors might be able to inspect a Piper Cub, but they couldn't touch our commercial fleet without months of additional certification and thousands of hours of supervised experience. At 7:45 a.m., 3 black SUVs with government plates pulled into the airport entrance, cutting through the morning traffic like sharks through water. Shane's emergency response team was making their entrance. Within minutes, every maintenance operation would be under federal microscope. My phone rang with an unknown number bearing a local area code. "Henderson, this is Mason Rodriguez, Airport Authority Director. I need you back here immediately." "I'm sorry, Mr. Rodriguez, but I no longer work there. Mr. Clark terminated my employment this morning for refusing to compromise aviation safety." "Clark what?" Rodriguez's voice climbed an octave. "Henderson, we've got NTSB investigators swarming the facility and 8 aircraft grounded with no qualified inspection personnel. The passengers are getting restless and the airline executives are demanding answers. What the hell is going on?" I explained the situation while Rodriguez listened in increasingly stunned silence. When I finished, there was a long pause filled only by the sound of chaos in the background. "Henderson, get back here now, and bring whatever access cards or equipment Clark should have secured. We need to sort this mess out before the feds shut us down permanently." 20 minutes later, I was back in the maintenance hangar, this time accompanied by 2 NTSB investigators and a very pale Mason Rodriguez. Clark was nowhere to be seen, but his absence spoke volumes, probably locked in his office with lawyers, trying to figure out how to spin systematic safety violations into acceptable corporate risk management. Shane Bennett stepped out of the administrative offices carrying a thick folder of documents and a laptop computer. His expression was the same one I'd seen after aircraft accidents, grim determination mixed with professional anger at preventable tragedies. "Dutch," he said, "we've been through Clark's operational directives for the past 4 months. This is worse than we thought." He spread a series of printouts on the maintenance desk, each one representing a decision that had endangered human lives for the sake of quarterly profits. Systematic reduction of inspection intervals, elimination of redundant safety checks, pressure on mechanics to expedite clearances regardless of findings. We found 23 instances where standard protocols were bypassed or abbreviated. Rodriguez leaned over the documents, his face growing paler with each page. "How did this happen?" "We have oversight procedures." "Your oversight procedures were being managed by Clark," Shane replied. "He was essentially regulating himself. Classic case of regulatory capture, except instead of an industry corrupting government oversight, you had corporate management corrupting safety protocols." That's when Clark finally made his appearance, flanked by 2 airport security officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 6 hours. His pressed cacos were wrinkled, his polo shirt stained with coffee and sweat, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. "This is harassment," he announced to the room, his voice lacking its usual corporate confidence. "Henderson is a disgruntled employee making false accusations to cover his own incompetence. I demand to speak with your supervisor." Shane stepped forward, badge out, every inch the federal investigator. "I am the supervisor, Mr. Clark. Senior investigator Shane Bennett, NTSB. You're looking at federal charges for willful violation of aviation safety regulations." Clark's corporate bluster evaporated like water on hot metal. "I was trying to improve operational efficiency. Everything I did was within acceptable risk parameters established by industry best practices." "Whose risk parameters?" Shane asked. "Because the Federal Aviation Administration has very specific requirements for structural integrity testing. Requirements you ordered Henderson to ignore so you could meet departure schedules." The next 3 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed federal investigation. NTSB teams seized Clark's computer, his email files, and 4 months of operational directives. They interviewed every mechanic, every inspector, and every contractor who'd worked under his efficiency initiatives. The pattern that emerged was damning. Clark hadn't just cut corners, he'd systematically dismantled safety protocols to create artificial cost savings that looked impressive in quarterly reports. The $208 million in operational improvements he'd reported to headquarters came directly from deferred maintenance, abbreviated inspections, and pressure on experienced mechanics to work faster than safety allowed. At 2:30 p.m., Federal marshals arrived to arrest Clark on charges of willful endangerment and violation of federal aviation safety statutes. As they led him away in handcuffs, past passengers whose flights he delayed and mechanics whose expertise he dismissed, he shot me one last look of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Henderson," he snarled. "Yes, it is," I replied. Rodriguez walked over as the police cars disappeared, carrying away the man who'd nearly turned our facility into an accident waiting to happen. "Henderson, I owe you an apology, and I owe you a job. How does Regional Chief Safety Inspector sound? Direct report to me, full authority over all maintenance protocols, and a salary that reflects your actual value to this operation." I looked around the hangar at the mechanics and inspectors who'd been forced to work under Clark's dangerous efficiency standards. These were good people who'd been put in impossible positions, pressured to compromise their professional judgment for the sake of corporate metrics. "I'll take it," I said, "but we do this right. No shortcuts, no exceptions, no compromise on safety. Every aircraft that leaves this facility gets inspected properly, maintained correctly, and cleared for flight only when I'm satisfied it's safe to carry passengers. Whatever you need." 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my new office overlooking the maintenance floor when Shane called with an update on Clark's case. He took a plea deal, Shane said, 18 months federal prison, $500,000 fine, and permanent ban from any aviation-related employment. The airline's insurance company paid out $4.2 million in federal penalties. What about the aircraft? Clean bill of health after proper maintenance. Turns out you were right about those stress fractures. Metallurgical analysis showed they were 72 hours away from catastrophic failure. If that engine had separated during takeoff, we'd be investigating a mass casualty accident instead of celebrating a prevented tragedy. I hung up and walked to my window. Below, our maintenance teams were conducting thorough, methodical inspections on every aircraft. No rushed schedules, no corner cutting, no corporate pressure to compromise safety for profit margins. The Henderson safety protocols we'd implemented became the new industry standard for the region. Every inspection thorough, every certification legitimate, every aircraft cleared for flight only after meeting the highest safety standards. Clark had called me obsolete, a paranoid old-timer holding up progress. What he'd failed to understand was that some things can't be optimized, streamlined, or made more efficient. Sometimes the old way is the right way, especially when people's lives hang in the balance. I'd gone from fired mechanic to running the entire safety operation, all because I refused to compromise on 33 years of hard-earned expertise. Clark had tried to bury me, and instead dug his own professional grave. In aviation maintenance, there's an old saying, better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were on the ground. Preston Clark learned that lesson the hard way. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any organization isn't the one who breaks the rules. It's the one who changes them to benefit themselves while putting others at risk. In a world obsessed with efficiency and profit margins, the real heroes are the people who still believe that some things, like human lives, can never be compromised, no matter what the spreadsheet says.